The northern wind was not a sound. It was a physical force, a snarling, ice-toothed beast that clawed at Ilara's tiny, isolated cabin. It was the perfect place to disappear. For 2 years, she had buried herself in the deep, unforgiving wilderness of the Ethelwhit Peaks, fleeing the suffocating pity and judgment of the city after the tragic, unresolved death of her husband, a man who'd never truly loved her. The truth was, she hadn't just lost a partner, she'd lost her entire identity. She was a haunted shadow of the woman she used to be, a wounded heroine seeking simple, silent survival. Her solace was a small, pre-Civil War law cabin, a relic nestled on the edge of the vast, federally protected forest, a place where the land itself seemed to be holding a breath. Tonight, the air was thick, heavy with the promise of a blizzard that would seal her off from the world for days. Inside, the only light came from the sputtering wood stove, casting long, nervous shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Ilara, bundled in a thick wool sweater, was meticulously counting her dwindling stores: dried beans, canned peaches, and the last of the local butcher's venison jerky. She needed to make one last run into the nearest town, Oakhaven, 50 miles down the treacherous mountain road, but the snow was already piling against the door. A faint but distinct sound sliced through the white noise of the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was a guttural, wet sound, a deep, pained exhalation immediately muffled by the next gust. Ilara froze, her hand hovering over the pantry shelf. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the apathy she'd cultivated for 2 years. This was too close to her isolated haven. She reached for the heavy iron poker beside the stove, a pitiful weapon against a bear or a mountain lion, but all she had. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a heavy, dragging shuffle just beyond the cabin's thin door. It was no animal. It was the scent that confirmed it. Even through the thick wood and the freezing air, a metallic, primal smell reached her. The coppery, unmistakable scent of human blood, mingling sickly with the clean, cold smell of pine and snow. Against every instinct for self-preservation, Ilara lowered the poker. Curiosity, morbid and yet strangely compelled by her own brokenness, drove her forward. She lived by the rule of leaving no trace, but the thought of a person, gravely injured, dying just outside her door in the coming blizzard, was a greater pain than any fear of exposure. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she unbolted the door. The wind roared, spraying icy crystals into the cabin. Stumbling onto the snow-covered porch, she shielded her eyes. A massive shadow lay crumpled just 10 feet from her steps, half hidden by a snowdrift. It was a man, and he was enormous. He was clad only in ripped, blood-soaked trousers, his skin slick with sweat and snowmelt, his body a mass of finely corded muscle. His breathing was shallow, ragged, and punctuated by low, animalistic groans. A chilling, grievous wound, a jagged tear that looked less like a knife cut and more like the rake of a great claw, marred his side, already turning the fresh snow crimson. Even in his state of near death, he was intensely masculine, powerfully built, with a harsh, uncompromising handsomeness. His hair, dark and heavy with moisture, clung to a brow furrowed in agony. As Ilara knelt beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his bulk. His eyes, a startling, unusual shade of glacial blue, flickered open. They were wild, unfocused, burning with a raw, almost feral intensity. "Don't," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper thick with pain and an odd, deep accent. "Go." Don't be ridiculous, Ilara managed, the shock momentarily overridden by a sudden intense surge of protective fire. The raw side of him, wounded and exposed to the elements, struck a chord in her own deeply wounded spirit. You'll freeze to death in minutes. She saw his pupils dilate, not with fear, but with a momentary, fleeting gold spark that vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only the icy blue. It was enough. The sight triggered an unexplainable memory, a forgotten childhood legend of the woods, of things that walked at night. She brushed it aside as delirium. He was heavy, impossibly heavy, but with a desperate, frantic strength born of adrenaline and sheer will, she managed to drag his near unconscious body inside, across the threshold, and onto the rug beside the hearth. He groaned, a sound that resonated deep in his chest like a low growl, but he offered no resistance. The air in the cabin immediately charged with a fierce, almost electrical energy, and the metallic scent of his blood was now overwhelming. Ilara, the timid, emotionally paralyzed widow, was suddenly in crisis mode. She was face to face with an enormous, bleeding stranger in the middle of a blizzard. It was the furthest thing from her quiet refuge. As she struggled to cut away the remaining scraps of his ruined clothes, her fingers brushed the heavy, muscular curve of his neck. Under her touch, his pulse hammered, too fast, too strong, and utterly wrong. He was not human. A chilling realization began to coalesce in her mind, a creeping suspicion that this man, this injured, devastatingly handsome stranger, was the key to the terrifying, magnetic destiny that had been waiting for her all along. The blizzard howled, sealing her fate with the man she had just saved. Ilara stood back, her hands trembling, staring at the man now sprawled before her hearth. His sheer physicality was intimidating, yet his vulnerability was what held her captive. The massive gash on his side was ghastly, a wound no ordinary man could have sustained, let alone survived in the freezing snow. She had used every clean piece of linen she owned to staunch the bleeding, applying pressure until her arms ached, and finally binding the injury with an expertly applied tight compress. "What are you?" she murmured, more to the shadows than to him. The question hung unanswered in the air, thick with steam and the scent of medicinal herbs she had quickly brewed. His deep, powerful body barely fit on the rug. Even unconscious, he held himself with a terrifying, almost regal stillness. The glacial blue eyes were shut, hiding the brief, golden flash she had witnessed. His lips were chapped, his breathing less ragged now, but still too shallow. He was running a fever, his skin hot beneath her fingertips. Ilara knew the wound needed professional medical attention, stitches, antibiotics, maybe even surgery. But Oak Haven was 50 miles away, and the blizzard was now a deafening, impenetrable wall outside her cabin. They were utterly isolated. She found herself hovering over him, compelled to tend to him despite the escalating fear and confusion. As she gently wiped the sweat from his brow, she noticed the faintest hint of scars, not ugly, puckered marks, but fine, pale lines that spider-webbed across his torso, suggesting a lifetime of violent encounters or perhaps rapid, miraculous healing. For the rest of the night, Ilara became his silent nurse. She fed the wood stove, keeping the cabin intensely hot to combat his shivering fever. She changed the bloody compress 3 times, marveling each time at the wound's bizarre appearance. It wasn't clean, it was torn, as if ripped open by something vast and impossibly strong. The only time he stirred was just before dawn. He let out a sharp, strangled cry, arching his back, his eyes snapped open, blazing with that intense, predatory light. He wasn't looking at her.
He was looking through her, perhaps through the walls, consumed by some inner savage terror. Rylan, he ground out, the name a whisper of steel and anguish. Then his eyes dropped to meet hers, and the wildness receded, replaced by a sudden, unnerving awareness. He was focused entirely on her face. Ilara didn't flinch, even though his raw intensity made her entire body buzz. "You're safe," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're in my cabin. I'm Ilara." He tracked her movements as she slowly poured him a cup of water, his gaze possessive and heavy, weighing on her like a physical pressure. He managed to sit up slightly, flexing muscles that should have been too torn to move. He took the water in a hand that dwarfed the tin mug, his grip unsteady but strong.
He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "But my mate, she wasn't like them. She was human, like you, and she didn't want the life. I refused to cage her. I refused to force her to live by the violent laws of the pack. Rylan used that as proof of my weakness, my divided loyalty. He challenged me, defeated me, and he nearly killed me to ensure I couldn't return." Ilara felt a deep ache in her chest. Cain wasn't just a powerful alpha. He was a man who had sacrificed his kingdom and his safety for the freedom of the woman he loved. This act of profound, selfless loyalty deepened the slow-burn romance. He was a protective, emotionally complex hero, not just a brute. "And your mate? Where is she now?" Ilara asked, dreading the answer. Cain's expression hardened, his eyes filling with an unbearable loneliness. "She died, Ilara. In the chaos of the challenge, she was caught in the crossfire. Rylan ensured that her death was blamed on me, the weak alpha who loved a human. Now, the true blood believes I abandoned my duty, and for that, my life is forfeit." The weight of his trauma settled between them, a shared grief. Ilara, the widow, understood loss. Cain, the deposed alpha, understood betrayal. The cabin became a silent sanctuary for two broken people. "They will be back," Cain warned, pulling the conversation back to the present danger. "The blizzard only slowed them. They are hunting me for defying the law, and now for the injury I inflicted upon one of Rylan's enforcers. And more importantly," he lifted his hand, tentatively reaching out, his fingers hovering near her neck. A profound, almost mystical look of discovery crossed his face. "They can smell your scent on me. They will think you are my new mate, the one I ran away with, the human I chose over the pack. Your scent is unique. It's—" Ilara inhaled sharply. She had always thought her scent was just pine needles and wood smoke. "What does that mean?" she whispered. Cain slowly brought his hand to cup her cheek, his touch tender and possessive. The air between them thickened, charged with the inexplicable cosmic pull of destiny. "It means that you don't just smell human, Ilara. You smell of—" Cain's touch on her cheek was a brand, and his words, "It means that you don't just smell human, Ilara. You smell of," hung in the charged air, thick with unspoken meaning. Ilara's mind raced, connecting the dots, the magnetic pull she felt toward him, the immediate protective fury he had shown, and now this declaration of a fated scent. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, a profound worry etched itself onto his face, shadowing the intensity in his eyes. "You smell of new life, Ilara, and something else. Something ancient, something that shouldn't be here. It's the scent of a true mate, Ilara. Rylan will recognize it. He won't just hunt me, he will hunt you to claim that power for the true blood." The realization was terrifying. She wasn't just an accessory to his flight. She was now the prize, the very source of the danger. "So what do we do?" Ilara asked, her fear strangely tempered by a rising tide of protectiveness for Cain. She looked into his eyes, not seeing a savage beast, but a man driven by honor and grief. She had found a purpose again, and it was tangled up in his survival. "We leave," Cain stated, his resolve hardening. He rose, moving stiffly but with returning strength. He quickly dressed in the spare, patched clothes Ilara had provided, his gaze never leaving her. "I am leaving tonight under the cover of darkness. The full moon is 3 nights away. My strength will return fully then, but my control will be tested. I have to be far away from here." "I'm coming with you," Ilara declared, her voice firm. Cain stopped, staring at her with disbelief and rising anger. "Absolutely not. This is not a journey for a human woman, Ilara. This is flight through savage territory towards a remote sanctuary. You must stay here. They might pass you over if they believe I have moved on alone." "They won't," she countered, stepping closer. "You said they smelled my scent on you. If I stay here, they will eventually find me and they will use me to draw you out. I would rather face whatever is out there with you than wait here, alone, for them to come." She met his gaze, pouring every ounce of her resurrected resilience into that moment. She wasn't the timid, broken widow anymore. She was forged in the fire of his confession and the heat of his protective passion. Cain looked at her, truly looked at the unwavering determination in her eyes, and a muscle ticked in his jaw. The refusal died on his lips, replaced by a deep, powerful reverence. He saw the Alpha Queen in the making, even if she only saw a woman fighting for her life. "You are reckless," he finally conceded, his voice heavy with reluctant admiration. "But you are also right. If they find you, they will assume you are my claimed mate, and they will hurt you to get to me." "Then we go together." "But how?" Cain moved to the wall, grabbing a worn backpack she used for gathering herbs. "I know this territory better than any of Ryland's trackers, even wounded. I won't use the roads. We move through the deepest part of the Etherwood, towards the old mountain pass. There is a den, a neutral zone used by outcasts, 3 days' travel from here. If we can reach it by the full moon, we will have temporary safety." He began efficiently packing the cabin's meager survival supplies: jerky, flour, a water skin, and Ilara's heavy woolen cloak. His movements were precise, economical, the movements of a natural predator and leader. As he worked, a low, unsettling vibration began to hum through the cabin floor. It was subtle first, almost imperceptible, but it grew quickly, a deep, resonating thrumming that tightened the air. "What is that?" Ilara whispered, looking around wildly. Cain froze, his eyes instantly turned dark and fearful. He dropped the bag. "The moon! It's not just 3 nights away. The residual power of the shift, the stress of the fight, it's amplifying the pull. I didn't realize how weak I am." He began to tremble violently, clutching his head. "Ilara, you need to tie me up now. Use the ropes, the thickest ones. I need to be secured before I lose control entirely." His command was desperate, terrified. The magical rules were asserting themselves with frightening speed. His transformation was not dependent only on the lunar cycle. His heightened emotions and physical exhaustion were making the shift uncontrollable. "Cain, what are you saying? You can't shift yet. We need to leave." "I can't stop it," he roared, falling to his knees, his hands already starting to enlarge, his fingers thickening. His breath came in huge, rattling gasps. The blue of his eyes fractured, a searing gold light pouring into the iris. He was slipping away from her, becoming the very monster he feared. Ilara didn't hesitate. She threw the heavy, thick rope around the main support beam, then cinched it around his already massive biceps. She worked frantically, looping the rope multiple times, her fingers scraping against the tightening muscles, securing him to the wood with a series of quick sailor's knots she hadn't known she remembered.
As she worked the last knot, the last vestiges of the man looked at her. It was a searing, raw glance of pure terror and apology. "If I try to bite you, Ilara, you must leave. Do not stay." It was a desperate plea, the sacrifice he was making for his safety. He rode a major character arc from protector to burden. The magical rules had overridden his emotions. But then he lunged against the ropes, his feral gold eyes fixed on Ilara. He didn't seem to recognize her. He only saw prey, or perhaps the source of the intoxicating, aggravating scent of a mate. Ilara backed away, clutching the axe, her breath trapped in her lungs. She had tied him, and now she had to rely on those frail knots against the immense primal power of a fully realized alpha. This was the moment of reckoning for her resolve. The fear was paralyzing, but stronger than the fear was the memory of Cain's humanity, his sacrifice. She wouldn't abandon him. Before she could close the trapdoor, she heard the front door of the cabin violently rattle, not the tentative testing from before, but a forceful, deliberate impact. "Cain, we know you're in there." A harsh masculine voice sliced through the silence of the cabin above. "The mate's scent is strong. You can't hide her, coward." Ryland's trackers were here. Ilara had a split second to act. She slammed the heavy cellar door shut, dropped the wooden latch, and then shoved the flour barrel back over the spot. The cellar was hidden, but the alpha's roar, muffled but profound, was a giveaway. The front door exploded inward with a sickening crack, ripped from its hinges. The icy wind howled into the cabin. Ilara pressed herself.
The cold hit Ilara like a physical blow, snapping her into hyper-awareness. She landed hard in a snowdrift, the icy shock of the jump momentarily stealing her breath. Behind her, she heard the furious shouts of Fenris and the heavy, rhythmic thudding of bodies crashing through the small window she'd just shattered. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the pack close. She didn't look back. She simply ran, plunging into the dense, silent forest behind the cabin. Her goal wasn't escape. She knew she couldn't outrun shifters. Her only objective was to draw them far enough away from the cabin to give Cain a fighting chance to free himself without collateral damage and to recover his sanity. The forest floor was treacherous, hidden beneath a fresh layer of snow. Ilara pushed through low-hanging branches, the thick woolen cloak snagging on thorns, the icy air burning her lungs. She could hear the trackers immediately behind her, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Their pursuit was not hurried. It was a patient, cruel circling, enjoying the hunt. "Stop running, mate," Fenris roared, his voice chillingly close. "It's pointless. You only delay the inevitable." Ilara risked a glance over her shoulder. Fenris was barely 20 feet back, moving through the undergrowth with an almost effortless grace. His eyes were not golden yet, but they held the merciless glare of a predator ready to pounce. Just as her muscles screamed in protest and her legs began to fail, she spotted what she needed, a narrow, frozen creek bed winding down a shallow ravine. It was icy, dangerous, and offered a chance to disrupt their scent trail. She veered sharply, sliding down the embankment and onto the slick ice. The shifters followed instantly. Fenris skidded to a stop at the top, his face contorted in frustrated rage. "She's trying to wash the scent. Spread out. Follow the movement." Ilara ran, her boots skidding on the ice, her exhaustion overwhelming. The thought of Cain, furious, trapped, and feral, was the only thing driving her. She had to ensure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. Suddenly, she misjudged a step. Her ankle twisted sharply, sending a lance of blinding pain up her leg. She cried out, stumbling, dropping the pack and collapsing onto the unforgiving ice. Fenris launched himself from the embankment, landing silently beside her.
He grabbed her arm, his grip crushing, pulling her up and spinning her around until her back was against his hard chest. His knife was pressed cold against her throat. End of the line, human. You were more trouble than you were worth. Now, you will lead us back to the cabin, and you will unlock that door, or you will bleed out right here. Ilara's vision swam with pain and fear. It was over. She had failed Cain. But just as Fenris began to drag her back up the ravine, the air itself seemed to crackle. A sound, a phenomenon rather than a simple noise, erupted from the direction of the cabin. A massive, triumphant, blood-curdling howl that spoke of pure, unbridled alpha fury. It was a sound of freedom and devastating intent. It was the howl of a creature unshackled, instantly followed by the crash of splintering wood and stone, the sound of the cellar beam finally giving way. Fenris froze, his grip slackening infinitesimally. The howl wasn't just loud, it carried an immense territorial power that shook the very ground they stood on. "He's loose!" the betas shouted from the trees. "He's feral! He's killing the cabin!" Fenris hesitated for a crucial second, fear flickering in his eyes. A feral alpha was a loose cannon, immensely powerful and impossible to predict. He was supposed to bring Cain back for Ryland's structured execution, not unleash a monster on the forest. In that second of distraction, Ilara twisted free, driving her heel back into Fenris's shin. He grunted, releasing her arm. She didn't run. She grabbed the thick, icy stone from the creek bed and swung it blindly, connecting with the side of his head. Fenris bellowed, staggering back, momentarily stunned. The knife clattered onto the ice. Ilara bolted, scrambling up the opposite bank of the ravine. She didn't get far before she heard the sound behind her, not the running of men, but the heavy thump, thump, thump of a massive wolf giving chase. Fenris had shifted. She closed her eyes, preparing for the impact, knowing she couldn't survive the pounce of a shifter in his full form. The pounce came, but it didn't hit her. Instead, a blur of gray, even larger and more powerful than the shifters who hunted him, slammed into Fenris. It was Cain, fully transformed, his eyes still burning with feral gold, but his movements were targeted, deliberate. He was enraged, but that rage was focused entirely on the enemies threatening his mate. The fight was instant, brutal, and deafening. Cain, the feral alpha, fought with a primal ferocity that Fenris, even in his wolf form, couldn't match. Teeth tore, bodies collided, and guttural snarls ripped through the air. Ilara watched, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of his protective fury. Then, Cain managed to clamp his huge jaws around Fenris's throat. There was a sickening crunch, and the fight ended with a choked, despairing whimper. The two other trackers, witnessing the sheer savage power of the deposed alpha, a power they had assumed was broken, turned and fled into the forest, leaving their downed leader behind. Cain stood over the fallen wolf, his breath clouding the air. The gold in his eyes were slowly, agonizingly starting to recede. He was trembling, shaking off the bloodlust, fighting the instinct to savage the territory. Then slowly, he turned his massive head toward Ilara. She stood frozen, waiting for the inevitable feral attack. But the immense wolf did not pounce. Instead, he lowered his head, inching forward cautiously, his tail giving the faintest, almost imperceptible wag. He nudged her gently with his massive snout, then licked her injured ankle, his tongue rough but careful. The primal instinct of the wolf, fueled by the fated mate bond, had superseded the feral madness. He recognized her. He was protecting her. Ilara sank to her knees, reaching up and embracing his massive neck. She buried her face in his coarse, bloody fur, sobbing with relief and a profound, overwhelming rush of love. "You came back," she whispered, the words shaking with emotion. "You came back for me, Cain." The wolf pressed his head against her, a low, rumbling sound of contentment in his chest. In the midst of the blood, the terror, and the chaos, their emotional breakthrough was complete. They were two broken halves, irrevocably bound by sacrifice, trust, and the desperate, reckless love that had defied logic, magic, and the laws of the pack. She had saved the man, and the alpha had saved her. The cold air was silent again, the terrifying sound of the fight replaced by the ragged panting of the great wolf. Ilara remained kneeling on the creek bank, holding on to Cain, feeling the powerful, stabilizing weight of his body against hers. The scent of blood was strong, but underneath was the familiar, comforting musk of his shifting form, mingled with the potent, earthy smell of the wild. She slowly pulled back, running her hands over the fur on his head and neck. The gold was still bright in his eyes, but it was no longer wild. It was focused, possessive, and filled with a deep, consuming adoration that transcended his animal state. He licked her cheek once, a warm, rough gesture of confirmation. "We have to move," Ilara whispered, the practicality of survival overriding the emotional shock. Her ankle throbbed painfully, but the adrenaline still surged. "They'll return for the mate," Payne rasped, reaching out and pulling her close, resting his head against her shoulder. "We face the final challenge, together." The commitment was sealed. They were no longer running from something, but running toward a shared future, even if that future was fraught with the danger of the full moon and the ruthless pursuit of the true blood pack. The next phase was war. The kiss, the confession, and the alpha's vow, all of it imbued Ilara with a fierce, unwavering strength. The pain in her ankle was a dull ache, secondary to the roaring conviction in her heart. They spent a precious hour in the shelter of the cave, regaining minimal strength while the sun climbed higher, casting pale light through the curtain of ivy. Cain, dressed now and fully alert, was no longer just her lover. He was her general. He explained the journey ahead with brutal clarity. They were heading for the Iron Summit, a remote, ancient, neutral territory high in the peaks, a place rumored to be safe from even the most ruthless.
Around midday, they paused on a ledge overlooking the vast expanse of the lower mountains. The wind here was a constant, biting reminder of their elevation. Cain pointed toward a distant, dark line cutting through the valleys below. "That is the old boundary. If we cross it, we enter the neutral zone. But Rylan knows that. He will be waiting to intercept us." As he spoke, Ilara suddenly sensed it. Not a sound, but a feeling. A familiar, creeping sense of dread, amplified by the elevation and the purity of the air. It was a faint, yet undeniable sense of wet dog and ozone riding the wind currents. "They're here," Ilara whispered, gripping his hand tightly. "The second wave. I can smell them." Cain's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. He hadn't expected them this quickly. The fight with Fenris must have forced them to push their speed, shifting and running without rest. Shifters. 2 of them. Fast, strong, enforcers. He confirmed, his voice rough. "They're circling the base of this peak, trying to cut us off before we reach the summit. They will wait for us to exhaust ourselves on the climb." This was the final challenge, a strategic war of attrition. Rylan was using the terrain against the injured alpha. Cain's face, already gaunt with exhaustion, tightens with lethal determination. He looked toward the summit, a sheer, treacherous climb that lay just above them. Ilara, he said, turning to face her, his hands gripping her shoulders. I have to give them a distraction. I have to draw them up away from the easiest ascent. I will lead them on the treacherous ridge path. You must take the hidden trail, the one I showed you behind the split rock, and continue to the summit. It's a narrow chimney, but it will hide your scent. This was a terrible risk. Splitting up meant exposing the mate, but staying together meant certain capture. No, Kane, you can't face two enforcers alone while wounded, she protested, the fear a sharp terror in her throat. I won't be alone, he said, a grim smile touching his lips. He looked past her, toward the distant mountains where the True Blood Pack resided. I am going to issue a challenge. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the icy air. Then he threw back his head and let loose a sound that was more than just a call. It was a seismic shockwave of pure alpha power, amplified by the height and the ancient magic of the peaks. It was the howl of a deep-hosed king, wounded but defiant, calling his enemies to battle, openly challenging Ryland's claim to the land, the title, and the mate. It wasn't the frantic snarl of the feral beast. It was a clear, calculated sound of war. The howl echoed from miles, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. That was a declaration of war, Ilara. It will draw every shifter in the area. It tells Ryland I am not defeated, and I claim you as my queen. Now, go. I will see you on the summit. Do not stop. I will follow the sound of your heart. He gave her a rough, quick kiss, a desperate promise, then shoved her toward the hidden crevice and turned, moving with impossible speed toward the exposed ridge path, directly toward the intercepting enforcers. He was sacrificing his safety, perhaps his life, to ensure her survival and cement their joint destiny. Ilara didn't hesitate. She plunged into the narrow, dark crevice, leaving her alpha to face the battle, her heart pounding out a furious rhythm, the silent signal he had promised to follow. The ultimate test of their bond had begun. Ilara squeezed through the narrow crevice, emerging onto a sheer, vertical chimney trail that was barely wide enough for her shoulders. Kane's powerful roar still echoed in the mountain air, a sound of defiance and command that both terrified and exhilarated her. She could only hear the distant, responding snarls of the two enforcers, drawn instantly toward the Alpha's challenge on the exposed ridge path. The trail was agonizing. She was forced to climb, using icy handholds and scrambling over loose rock, her bandaged ankle protesting with every movement. But the fear of being captured and the fierce need to reach the summit, their promised rendezvous, fueled her. She focused entirely on the image of Kane's face, on the blue-eyed certainty of his promise. I will follow the sound of your heart. She channeled her emotion, her love, her terror, into the frantic, pounding rhythm of her pulse, sending a silent signal through the vast, cold emptiness of the mountains. As she climbed higher, the air grew thinner, and the cold became a sharp, mind-numbing pain. She began to see the summit, a jagged, flat expanse of ice and ancient stone, marked by the wind-sheared stump of a single ancient redwood. Suddenly, the sounds of the battle reached her, muted by the stone, but unmistakable. Two distinct snarls, and then Kane's roar deeper and more sustained than before, indicating he had been forced to shift. The sounds were moving higher, closer to her position on the sheer cliff face. He was drawing them up the mountain, exactly as he had planned.
Just as she pulled herself over the last ledge and onto the flat, icy plateau of the iron summit, she heard a horrifying sound, a desperate, choked cry, immediately followed by the heavy thud of a body falling down the mountain face. One of the enforcers was gone. Cain had prevailed. But at what cost? Ilara stumbled onto the summit, gasping for breath, collapsing behind the massive redwood stump. She was in the neutral zone, but she was alone. The sky above was a brilliant pale blue, but the air felt charged, expectant. She waited, her eyes fixed on the point where the treacherous ridge met the summit. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had he survived? Had he been too injured to follow? Then she saw him. A huge gray shadow appeared on the ridgeline. It wasn't the fluid, silent predator she had seen before. This wolf was staggering, bleeding from multiple wounds, his movements ragged and slow. He was exhausted, near his limit, but he was here. He struggled onto the summit, collapsing immediately on the cold stone. Ilara scrambled toward him, heedless of the danger. Cain! Oh my God! She reached him just as his massive body began to convulse, the final, agonizing transformation beginning. She turned away, covering her eyes, listening to the shift. This time, a sound of immense relief and exhaustion,